Alright, here we go. First thing I'm going to do is just look over the overall condition of the truck, the bumper, the fenders, everything, make sure that there's no major damage. The second thing I'm going to do is look for the 4 L's. First L, the license plate. Make sure it's clean, properly mounted, secured, and that it's up to date. The second L, I'm going to see if it's leaning. If it's leaning, it's going to indicate a flat tire, broken spring, shifted load, something like that. The third L is leaks. I'm going to look under the truck and make sure I don't see any puddles of anything, which would indicate oil, diesel fuel, radiator, antifreeze, whatever. And the fourth L is the lights. I'm going to make sure that they're the proper color, properly mounted, secured, and that there's no fogging over the headlights or any discoloration. Next thing, I'm going to go ahead and open the hood. I'm going to start with the passenger side. Alright, I'm going to start from the top and work my way down to the bottom. Just going to look at the windshield, make sure it's clean, there's no illegal stickers, no chips or cracks bigger than the tip of my thumb. I'm going to look at the windshield wiper, make sure the blade on it's not torn or ripped, make sure it's not weather beaten, make sure the tension on the windshield wiper is a proper tension. I work my way down to the air intake. I'm just going to look over basically the whole thing, make sure there's no damage, all the metal on the cold air intake and the intake. The turbo, I'm going to make sure that there's no cracks or any kind of damage. The rubber pieces, I'm going to make sure everything's properly mounted, secured, no abrasions, bulges, or cuts or on any of the rubber hoses. The clamps, I'm going to make sure the clamps are in place and properly tight. From here, I'm going to go ahead and look at my turbo. I'm going to make sure my turbo is properly mounted, secured, it's not damaged, and there's no leaks. I'm going to look at my exhaust as far as I can, make sure that there's no damage, it's properly mounted, secured. I'm going to make sure there's no black soot, which would indicate some kind of a leak. Work my way over to the alternator. I'm going to make sure the alternator is properly mounted, secured, not damaged, it is belt driven. There's no frays, cuts, or corrosion on any of the wiring. Check the belt since it is belt driven. Make sure there's not more than 3/4 inch of play. Work my way down to the water pump. I'm going to make sure the water pump is properly mounted, secured, no damage, no cracks, it's not leaking. This one here is gear driven. I'm going to look at all my hoses for the radiator. These are the heater hoses. I'm going to make sure they are properly mounted, secured, no abrasions, bulges, or cuts, and that they're not leaking. Peek at my fan, make sure it's not missing any blades, none of the blades are cracked or broken. Fan shroud, just make sure there's no damage, it's mounted and secured. I'm going to peek at the radiator, it's kind of hard to see. I'm going to make sure there's no damage, it's properly mounted, secured, and there's no leaks. While we're here, I'm going to go ahead and cover my reservoir. I'm going to make sure that the truck is cool. I'll take off the cap to make sure I got enough antifreeze in it. I'm going to make sure it's properly mounted, secured, not damaged, and not leaking. Same with all the hoses, no abrasions, bulges, or cuts, make sure they're not leaking. From here, I'm going to go ahead and go onto the driver's side. This one here, I'm going to cover this side of the windshield. Make sure it's clean, no illegal stickers, chips or cracks bigger than the tip of my thumb. I'm going to check the windshield wiper on this side, make sure it's got the proper tension. Make sure that the blade's not weather beaten, torn, or ripped in any way. Work my way down. I'm going to check this side of the air cleaner. Make sure it's properly mounted, secured, not damaged. Windshield wiper fluid. Again, make sure it's properly mounted, secured, not damaged, and there's no leaks. Work my way across to this part of the air intake. Again, the metal. Make sure there's no chips or cracks and illegal welds. The rubber boots, I'm going to make sure there's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. And again, I'm going to check the clamps, make sure they're tight and in the proper position. While I'm in this area, I'm going to go ahead and cover my air compressor. I'm going to make sure it's properly mounted, secured, and not leaking. And the air compressor is gear driven. Also, check my hoses on my airlines, make sure there's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts, and no leaks. Since I'm here, I'm going to check my oil. I pull out the dipstick, wipe it off, put it back in, pull it off, make sure it's between the add and the full. If it's under add, I would add some oil. Check my steering column. Can't have more than 10% play. I'm going to look at the front or the top and the bottom U-joints, make sure they're properly greased, not damaged. And the rubber boot, I'm going to make sure it's not torn or weather beaten or damaged in any way. I'm going to follow down my steering column. Since I'm here, I'm going to cover my Power steering reservoir, make sure it's properly mounted secured, not leaking, no damage. The hoses, no abrasions, bulges, or cuts, properly secured, and no leaks. Follow that down to my steering box. Again, I'm going to make sure it's properly mounted secured, no damage and no leaking. Come down here to my pitman arm. I'm going to make sure that the drag link and the pitman arm are properly mounted secured with a castle nut and a cotter pin. I'm going to follow my drag link, make sure that my drag link and my tie rod end are properly mounted secured, again with a castle nut and a cotter pin. That ends my steering linkage here, so I'm going to go ahead and start my suspension. My front spring hanger, make sure it's properly mounted secured, not damaged. I'm going to look at my springs. You can't have more than a quarter of the springs broke. No damage, you can't be scissoring in any way. Follow that back to my saddle here. I'm going to make sure my saddle is properly mounted secured, not broken. With U-bolts, I'm going to make sure the nuts on the bottom of the U-bolts are tight and nothing's damaged. While I'm here, I'm going to cover my shock. Properly mounted on the top and the bottom, and it's not leaking. Follow my springs back to the shackles in the back spring hanger. Again, make sure there's no damage. They're properly mounted secured. From there, I'm going to come to my frame. Make sure there's no chip or cracks, illegal welds, or illegal holes. Since I'm here on my frame, I'm going to go to my air brakes. I'm going to look at my brake line, make sure there's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts or leaks. I'm going to look at my ABS line, which is a small one. Make sure there's no cuts, frays, or corrosion. I'm going to follow my brake line and my air chamber or brake canister, or whatever you want to call it. Make sure it's properly mounted secured, no damage, and that it's not leaking. Follow that into the caliper. Again, make sure it's properly mounted secured, no damage. I'm going to look inside the caliper, check out my pads. They got to have at least a 1/4 inch or more. They can't be chipped or cracked or any damage in any way. From there, I'm going to look at my disc or rotor. Make sure it's not discolorated, which would indicate heat. Make sure there's no grooves or cracks in that. That finishes out my brakes. So I'm going to look at the inside and the outside of the wheel. And make sure there's no stress cracks or any damage to the wheel itself. And make sure the tire is properly mounted on the bead of the wheel. Make sure there's no damage to the bead. The tire itself, I'm going to look at the inside, the top, and the outside. Make sure there's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. The depth has to be at least 4/32, and they have to be virgin tires on the front. I'm going to work my way down to the lug nuts. Aluminum wheels, you'll see black streaks, shininess around the lug, or shiny threads indicating a leak or a loose lug nut. Take this cap off, you'll have your seal cover. Make sure it's properly mounted secured, no damage, not leaking. There's a rubber piece you take off. Make sure you got at least a knuckle depth of oil. From here, you'd go to your valve stem. Make sure it has a cap, which this one does. This is also where I would check the inflation with a gauge. From here, I'm done with this area. I'm going to go ahead and close the hood real quick. Oh, excuse me. Clear. Okay, while I'm undoing the side of the truck, I'm going to look at my reflector. Make sure it's properly mounted secured, no damage. It's also a clearance light. Work my way down to the side of the truck. You got this light here. This is your turn, clearance, and your four-way. While we're here, I'm going to check the mirror. Make sure the mirror is properly mounted secured. I'm going to look at the door, make sure it opens, make sure it closes. I'm going to pick up a little bit, make sure the hinges are good. And I'm going to check the weather stripping all the way around the door, make sure it's not torn, cut, or missing. Check my handle whites here, make sure it's properly mounted secured. Work my way down to the steps. I'm going to make sure that they are properly mounted secured, not damaged in any way. The skirting, same thing, properly mounted secured, no damage. Under here's my batteries. I'm going to make sure the batteries are mounted secured. Make sure that there's no leaks. And on the battery cables, make sure they're not cut, frayed, or any corrosion. I'm going to work my way back to the doors. Look at the window. Make sure that they're mounted secured. They're not going to come flying off or open up driving down the road. Since I'm here, I'm going to go over my tank. Make sure it's properly mounted secured, that there's no damage or leaks. The tank strap and the static strap, we're going to make sure are in place, mounted secured, no damage. I'm going to take off the cap, make sure it has the safety chain and the rubber gasket inside the cap. here, I'm going to work my way around to the back of the truck. I'm going to start from the top. I'm going to make sure I got the reflective DOT tape on the top and the outside corners. This one needs to be a little higher legally, but they at least have it. I'm going to make sure that my hangers are doing good, that they're not going to come off. Look at my exhaust, make sure it's properly mounted secured, no black soot, which would indicate some kind of leak, and there's no damage. While I'm looking at my exhaust, I'm going to check out my drive shaft. Make sure there's no illegal welds, no damage. Make sure the front and the back U-joints are properly greased and that they're not damaged. While I'm doing a jungle gym here on the airlines, I'm going to go ahead and check the airlines. Make sure they're properly mounted secured, no leaks, no abrasions, bulges, or cuts. My electric line, make sure the spring-loaded lid is properly working. Make sure it's got the little safety nipple there that's not broken off. On the wire, on the electric line, make sure there's no cuts, frays, or corrosion. My air lines and my electric lines, I'm going to follow them all the way around, looking for any kind of damage, abrasions, bulges, or cuts. Once I get to the trailer, again, properly mounted secured, no damage, no leaks. I would make sure the rubber gaskets inside the glad hands are in good shape, that they're not torn or cut. Again, on the trailer, I'm going to make sure the safety lid, the spring lid, is properly working and the safety nipple is not broke off. Make sure it is there. The wires, again, I'd make sure there's no cuts, frays, or any kind of corrosion. Come back to the truck. While we're here, I'm going to go ahead and do the suspension. This has two airbags on one axle, one side of the axle. There's no springs, so I'm going to make sure that both airbags are properly mounted secured on the top and the bottom. There's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts, and that they're not leaking. In between the airbags, you have another saddle that the airbags are sitting on. This Kenworth, it is welded on there, so I'm going to make sure that there's no cracked welds or any kind of damage. Right next to the saddle again is the shock. I'm going to make sure the shock is properly mounted secured on the top and the bottom. Make sure it's not leaking. From there, I'm going to check my airline again for my brakes. Make sure there's no abrasions, bulges, or cuts, no leaks. Into my air canister or my brake chamber, make sure it's properly mounted secured, no damage, no leaking. The other side of the brake chamber is a push rod. I'm going to make sure the push rod and the slack adjuster are properly mounted secured. Make sure there's not more than an inch of slack and that they're at 90 degrees. I'm going to look at the slack adjuster, make sure it's properly mounted secured to your S-cam. I'm going to follow the S-cam inside the braking mechanism, make sure the return springs and the rollers are there, not damaged. From there, I'm going to look at my brake shoes or pads. Again, have to have at least a 1/4 inch or more. They can't be chipped or broke or damaged in any way. I'm going to feel inside the drum. Just like the rotor up front, you want to make sure there's no grooving, any cracks or discoloration. This one has a little bit of a groove, actually. Okay, from the brakes, I'm going to look at both wheels. Inside and outside of both wheels, make sure there's no cracks or illegal welds or any kind of damage. I'm going to look in between the buds here, make sure I don't see any daylight. Sorry, it's got a little gap, it shouldn't be there. Make sure there's no daylight going through there. Make sure there's a 3-finger gap, no debris in between the tires. And no debris, I already said that. I'm looking at both tires, the inside, the outside of both tires, and the top, the overall condition. No abrasions, bulges, or cuts. Back here, they do not have to be virgin tires. The depth has to be at least 2/32 or more on the tires. Follow my way out to the outside of the wheel like we did the front. I'm going to make sure it's properly beaded to the wheel. Make sure around the bead that the wheel is not damaged or the tire is not damaged in any ways. The valve stem, again, make sure it has a cap. This is where I would check it with a gauge. The lug nuts. These are aluminum wheels again. You look for black streaks, shininess, or shiny threads, which would indicate a loose lug. This is your axle. Most of the time, if it's going to leak, it's going to leak inside where the brakes are, but I'd still check to make sure there's no damage, it's probably mounted secured, and that it's not leaking. From here, I'd go ahead and do my coupling system. I'm going to look at the apron. The bottom of the trailer is called the apron. I'm going to make sure there's no damage, illegal welds, or any broken welds. I'm going to make sure there's no gap, daylight, in between the apron and the skid plate, which right now there is because the truck and trailers in a dirt parking lot is kind of at an angle a little bit. Make sure it's properly greased. I'm going to make sure the skid plate is properly mount secured to the platform. On this one, it's a nut and bolt on the other side. Most of them are a pin and a cotter pin. I'm going to make sure that the platform is properly mount secured to the frame of the truck with mounting bolts, which are down here. I'm going to make sure none of the mounting bolts are broke or missing. I'm going to make sure that my release handle is pushed in at the locking position. From there, I'm going to work my way back to the back of the truck. I'm going to make sure the mud flaps have 100% DOT tape across them. I'm going to make sure they're not higher than 6 inches off the ground and that they're properly mount secured. I'm going to look at my lights, make sure they're properly mount secured, correct color and not broken. These lights back here are your tail lights, your four-ways, your brake lights, and your blinkers. While I'm under here, I'm going to go ahead and look at the kingpin and the locking jaws. I'm going to make sure I can't see any visual damage to the kingpin. Make sure they're properly greased and make sure the locking jaws are locked around the kingpin, which it looks like it's in pretty good shape. That will conclude the pre-trip on the truck. Oh gosh.